Доброго ранку.
Good morning, dear participants. We'll begin our conference by Unicef. Clean climate is not okay. How youth can fight the climate change. I'm Nastya. I work at Unicef with the change of climate and engaging the youth, and I'm happy to spend this day with you here. Our plan today is to talk to the authorities, representatives of the NGOs, of the business, about what the youth can do with what is going on in the climate change sphere, because it's us who will have to work with the consequences of the climate change. It's important because the climate crisis, it's up to us. It affects our rights. It affects our right to have access to clean water, to health, to a high-quality education, and many other spheres of life. And it's us,
З її наслідками.
the youth, who will have to face the consequences. Also, we'll have the chance to participate in the so-called World Cafe, an interactive format that will give you the chance to communicate and get familiar, get acquainted with other participants, and get inspired for your further projects. I kindly remind you that everyone has to wear the mask. Please switch your phones to the silent mode, and let's begin. So next, I'm giving the floor to the head of the UNICEF Department on Water, Hygiene and Sanitary, Sebastian Truffaut.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Sebastian Truffaut from UNICEF. I'm the head of the Water, Sanitation, Hygiene and Climate Change Adaptation. And today, the climate is no longer an environmental issue. It's a social crisis, a crisis for children's rights. Children are the most vulnerable in every crisis, and particularly this one. Climate change is no exception, and they are the least responsible for climate change. Climate change presents the world with a global, urgent crisis, challenge. But some essential facts about children and climate. In August this year, UNICEF released a report, the Children's Climate Index, where different parameters were taken to try to find out what were the challenges for children. So it found out that almost every children on Earth is exposed to a natural hazard and climate change event. Approximately 1 billion children, so almost half of it, of world children living in 33 countries, are classified with extremely high risks. So exposing them to a combination of multiple hazards that put their life in risks. And yet they are the least contributor, and those countries are the least contributing to the climate change. So if we take those 33 countries, this only represents 10% of the global emission, and only 0.5%, 0.5% for the 10 highest risk. Improving the resilience of critical services such as health, education, water and sanitation will reduce their risk, the risk they face. The climate crisis poses a significant threat to children and young people's health, nutrition, development, and then potential future. The overview that UNICEF supported last year and releasing these days give an overview, that's the climate landscape analysis for children, given an overview of the potential impacts of the climate change and environmental problems on children and youth. Air pollution, access to quality water and sanitation services, natural disaster, and environment in urban areas are the issue of the most concern. We can see that in Ukraine, more frequent heat waves, drought, will put children at risk of heat stress, renal disease, and respiratory diseases. As 2/3 of children live in city, this issue will affect a large population of children, of the child population. Many cities and regions are affected and are already affected by climate, energy, and environmental problems, and have poor child health indicators as well. However, some other factors, such as poverty, poor housing, smoking adults, and living in disaster-affected areas, informal settlements, impact the children's health too. Climate change is one of the greatest threats facing this generation. So world leaders have a significant, time-sensitive opportunity to redirect the diverse path we are on. Unicef is calling the government to really reduce the greenhouse emissions from now on, not in 10 years, but from now on. Increase investment in climate and adaptation and resilience, so resilience of services and infrastructure, and include youth people, in all climate regulation and decisions. UNICEF supports young people calls for government to end the consistent omission of young people, especially those from the most affected places. They need to be supported to fight climate change and damage to the environment by educating them to advocate at their respective location. Could be at subnational level or at national level. This is where UNICEF intervenes. What does UNICEF do in Ukraine? We joined the effort to prevent climate change and protect children's rights here too, by being involved in the development of strategies and policies, and especially the NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution, by improving the resilience of services, working on infrastructures in health centers, more services, educational facilities. But we involve the youth as well in our projects. For instance, with the European Union, we support the implementation of Eco project with Upshift. Those are small projects equipping young people with skills and resources to identify problems and try to find innovative solutions. And those fundings are up to 60,000 hryvnia. We recently supported youth eco initiatives, for instance, in water protection, water resource protection, waste sorting, and air pollution monitoring. In 2015, UNICEF launched the world's largest lesson promoting the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. In September 20 last year, we launched an annual lesson focusing on climate change and environment. Children worldwide have placed their trust into UNICEF, knowing that the organization that have always been there for 75 years now will not fail them in this critical moment for their present and their future at stake. So, to do so, UNICEF wants to follow 4 global advocacy priorities. Build a global movement to improve health outcomes for children. Drive a global advocacy effort to tackle the learning crisis, prioritizing the most vulnerable and marginalized children. Secure investment and action to bring an end to neglect, abuse, and childhood trauma that drive the poor mental health and outcomes, and life outcomes. And work with and for children to tackle environmental degradation and climate change so they can access clean water, clean air, clean and a safe and sustainable environment. And we need young people like you to join in these efforts. We know that speaking on climate-related events like this one, young people can send a message to government leaders, demanding stronger, bold commitments to tackle climate changes. So we count on you. Thank you.
Дякуємо, пане.
Thank you, Sebastian. And I would like to give floor to Marina Papatanco, a Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Youth and Sports Affairs of Ukraine. Thank you very much, dear friends. It's my pleasure to join and be part of this important panel discussion. And first of all, I would like to thank UNICEF for the attention and effort you invest in developing youth affairs. And in the Ministry of Youth and Sports, we do our best to make the voice of young people heard and make their impact tangible in all spheres of life in our country. And every day we feel the outcomes of climate change and climate crisis on our lives. And of course, the biggest impact will have on young people, and it already impacts the lives of young people. So the UNICEF initiatives of organizing today's discussion is extremely relevant and extremely important, and it's a very timely decision, and it's a good opportunity to demonstrate again the power and the impact that a young person can make, and a young person who is involved in discussion and making important decisions at a national level. And for young people, it's still another chance to develop confidence in their own strengths and their powers. And in my presentation, I will focus on young impact in particular, because the faith of young people really is based on our attitudes and the opportunities that we support and we convey to them, and which we provide to the youth. And in our work, we are convinced that young people should be involved in all processes in the country, and this is further confirmed by the main objective of our program called Youth of Ukraine, and the Youth Development Strategy for the period ending 2030, developed together with the UNICEF. And one of the priority issues in this strategy is the safety and security issue, which is very comprehensive and involves climate change among other things. And one of the most important things included into our program is participation, involving young people in decision-making on issues of concern. And this is the task of the program on the strategy, namely strengthening youth participation and strengthening their civic position with regard to important national and local issues that young people can be concerned of. And we have to develop a mechanism of joint action that would facilitate youth participation in decision making. And at present, we are working on developing these efficient mechanisms, and in our opinion, they are relevant and very timely. And now we are working on developing a mechanism of creating a national council on youth affairs that will be chaired by the Prime Minister of Ukraine, and members of which will be representatives of various ministries. And the issues that will be coordinated by the Ministry of Environment are issues that are important for young people as well. And the National Youth Council will become a platform at which they will be able to discuss these issues with their colleagues who are responsible for making decisions in this area, and to whom they will be able to present arguments of their positions as young people, which risks we feel, which challenges we face, and which joint decisions we see to tackle the problems that we are facing. And the Youth Council members will also representatives of youth self-government bodies, representatives of youth and children, civil society organizations, and youth councils. So it will be a unifying platform that will create possibilities for synergies to make decisions that are important for our country. So I encourage all of you to join these initiatives. And next year we're going to launch activities of the National Youth Council, and it will be raising or emphasizing issues related to education and awareness among young people, because all our activities as a ministry are focused on youth participation, of popularization of tools for involving young people in the decision-making processes, and in the first place it provides important competences and knowledge to young people. And in this way we would like to actualize or raise the issue of participation of young people high on the agenda by providing respective educational information and tools, including information about environmental problems. And we had a discussion with the colleagues from Unicef, from the Ministry of Environment, and after the strategy for youth development and other important strategies were developed in Ukraine, after that we are going to synchronize our effort and say that young people should be in the center of each strategy, and it's extremely important to integrate the vision of young people in all strategies in the countries. And we also have to support the idea of fulfilling the potential of the youth. It sounds very ambitious, but that will give force to young people, build on their confidence, believe their trust in their powers, in their environment, in their countries, and be part of transformations and invest their potential in bringing about changes that are important for Ukraine. And we have a nice Ukrainian phrase that we can turn the mountains upside down, and it's a Ukrainian saying, but that means that we believe in our youth, and we are looking forward to support of all the initiatives that we developed at a local level, but by local self-government bodies, because all changes that might be implemented go from the bottom up, and joint efficient decisions are made at such platforms that we create, such as the National Youth Council, that give voice to young people and give opportunities to young people to propose their efficient decisions. So I'm confident that the issues that we are going to discuss today and the analysis that we've heard is extremely important and relevant for our country, and young people should be integrated into all levels in decision making, and through that we will be able to achieve success and find those efficient solutions that are very important for us today. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Marina, for these opening remarks for our participants. And let us start our first panel discussion now. And the first panel is about presentation of the Unicef survey on climate risk impact on children. And the spoiler is that this impact is very important, and you will hear about it from our participants soon. And after the panel discussion, you'll have time for your questions, so you encourage you to listen very attentively. If you joined us online, you are also able to ask your questions in the comments to this live stream, and we will read them out for our moderator. Evgenia Kravchenko will be the moderator. She is an eco-activist and a founder of the initiative of high-quality involvement called Makitra. Evgenia, over to you. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to see everyone, and it's my pleasure to be part of it myself. And you know that worldwide the climate concern is a widespread notion, and it's also very important for us during this discussion. But we are not only going to talk about concerns, but we are going to talk about finding solutions as well. And the hour and a half will be dedicated to finding solutions of how young people and government authorities can cooperate to make this cooperation efficient, to make young people heard. And we heard Sébastien Truffaut, who is the head of the Unicef unit on water, hygiene and sanitary. Victoria Lupin is a specialist of the Unicef unit for water, hygiene and sanitary. Olena Meister, head of the unit of development of environmental policy of the Ministry of Environment and Nature Protection Resources of Ukraine. Natalia Shevchuk is the General Secretary of the National Youth Council, and Hanna, who represents Ecology organizations. So let us go deeper into the context. Sebastian, Victoria, could you share with us what the impact of the climate is on children and youth?
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to see all of the participants online and offline. All of you are either working to fight the climate change or at least interested in this topic and interested to know much more. And we'll help you do that today because we'd like to present the UNICEF study on assessment of the climate change and on the environment on the children and youth. You can see the presentation on screen. So the purpose of this study is finding out what the situation is about climate, environment and energy sector in Ukraine, its potential impact on children, and setting priority for UNICEF and recommendation for all stakeholders, for government and non-government organizations and young activists. We have defined the relevant problems, the government priorities, as well as the initiatives that are being implemented currently. We've defined who are the main players of a climate and environment field. Also, this report defines how the environmental problems impact children, which are the key for their development, and what should the government do as they prepare their strategies and priorities, which of these strategies are efficient and where the gaps are. And obviously the report also contains a number of recommendations for UNICEF and for all stakeholders. So let's begin with the context, the situation in Ukraine. Currently, 25% of Ukrainian population is children and young people. For our country, urbanization level is almost 70%, pretty high. This means that children and young people live predominantly in cities, and they can feel this impact of climate change because of the wind mode, the architecture, the ground matter that underlies the cities, and also due to the fact that the cities are the centers of pollution because of the number of vehicles, the industrial and energy sector companies and factories that are located in the cities. It also impacts the level of purification of the air, of the water quality, and the housing quality. The results of the modeling, the future forecasts, the average annual temperature will grow by more than 1 centigrade until 2030. It doesn't seem like much, but we can feel the change already. And the most vivid examples of such change is the growing number and the rate and intensity of the natural phenomena. We'll tell you what these phenomena are and on which locations, which areas of Ukraine are characteristic of that. The overall change of climatic conditions and the increase in the number of hot days is featured at all areas of Ukraine. 1/4 is in the floods, within the danger of floods, and almost 1/3 of Ukraine's population lives in these inundation-dangered areas. Western and central Ukraine and the Carpathian Mountains are endangered with the floods. The most recent big flood happened in summer of 2020. And in mountainous regions, floods also happen quite often. And combined with that, there are extreme natural phenomena such as landslides. If we move to the south of Ukraine, we would see a characteristic phenomena of droughts that affects about 1/6 of the entire territory of Ukraine. If we're talking about the changes in water quality and availability, this problem is impacting our entire country. Due to heat contamination, there are more evaporations and the quality of water declines. The water gets intoxicated with bacteria during water time, during later summertime. And the heat contamination that Sebastian mentioned, already mentioned, the heat waves happen increasingly often in eastern Ukraine, in southern Ukraine, in the cities. Now, fires last year, Lugansk region witnessed a huge fire, and it's also characteristic for the Police region and this so-called steppe region. Most of you are aware in the former Chernobyl zone, the fires over there. Last year, during these fires, Kiev for several times was on the top of the world rank of the most polluted cities. The desertification and salination are mostly in southern Ukraine and Kherson area. Maybe you have even been to Oleshkivsky Sands deserts. It's the largest desert in Europe. Probably the problem that is not getting enough coverage right now, but it's still relevant, is a sea level rising. Recently, the levels of the Black and Azov Sea has been rising by 2 to 3 millimeters, and by forecast modeling up to 2030, up to the year 2100, it might rise by 1 meter, which would mean the flooding of the deltas of the rivers and of the seashore cities. How does that impact the children and youth of Ukraine? It can be direct or indirect. A direct impact can be closing the schools and limited access to education because of the natural emergencies of phenomena. The infrastructure gets destroyed, the study and educational process stopped. Indirect impact is when the number of child abuse grows in the families due to stress factors and the psychological health of children and parents being under stress, being impacted negatively. Quite often, people have to flee the locations where they suffered from natural disasters. They move to other regions, and mostly they move to cities. During the floods of 2020, about 1,500 people were evacuated, but at the same time, there is no precise statistics, and now the people moving to other locations gets focused attention from the government, but it mostly applies to IDPs from eastern regions. And people who moved to other locations because of the climate change is still not getting enough attention. Because of natural disasters and floods, the infrastructure gets destroyed. In 2020, I happened to visit western Ukraine and see with my own eyes the consequences of floods of 2020, destroyed roads, bridges, schools and edifices and land lots near the households. The local small farmership households are suffering and impacting negatively the food safety and security of the people. The droughts in the eastern Ukraine also leads to loss of yield, of agricultural yield, and in the future climate change can result in disappearance of the certain types of grain, types of agricultural items. Also, stress and psychological health is the problem that doesn't get enough attention in the context of climate change and of environment. These are stress factors that impact our psychological health. On this map, you can see the most contaminated, the most polluted regions in Ukraine with the most air pollution. You can see this coincide with the territories with the most numerous population. The black one stands for the most polluted, the yellow stands for the most populated. According to the Ministry of Health, the leadership in mortality belongs to a factor called air pollution that impacts children and youth on all stages of their lives, starting from being in their mother's wombs. And the negative impact of air pollution is felt really acutely during the first years of life and can affect the further life. The most popular pollutants, the largest pollutants, are energy sector and transport sector and industry, which are located in the most densely populated areas. In 2018, in over one half of the cities in Ukraine, the maximum level of air pollution was exceeded by much. Of course, there are air monitoring stations, but their number is not sufficient in Ukraine right now. The state policy on climate, environment, and energy sector is focusing its attention on climate issues. Ukraine has ratified all the key international conventions on climate change. And later today, you'll have the chance to witness the second panel that then the topic of that will be Ukraine's participation in COP26, COP26. Also, Ukraine is signatory of the Kyoto Protocol and the UN Convention on Climate Change. So Ukraine participates in all of the major global processes on climate change. There's a number of strategies right now. The strategy of adaptation to climate change is underway, and the agreement on adaptation between EU and Ukraine is an effective instrument to build ecological legislation, but there are limiting factors like lack of coordination within the ministries and authorities and between the government sector and the NGOs and the young activists. And of course, there's a number of mechanisms that we already heard from Ms. Marina, that they plan to create further mechanisms, and there are current successful examples of engaging young people, but it still requires a lot of work. And none of the coordination mechanisms is analyzing the impact of climate change on Ukrainian children, so they are not in the focus of attention. Climate change and ecology impacts the child health. We have already mentioned the heat waves. They negatively impact the health of children. They raise the risk of cardiovascular diseases. Most often they impact the elderly people, of course not the children, but when we're talking about air pollution, this is the worst factor for respiratory and allergic diseases for children specifically. And air contamination is a very strong factor during the first years of children's lives. Industrial contamination, plastic, pesticides end up in food that we consume, and that's how they make their way to children's bodies and adults as well. I mean, we're talking about health. We should also mention that in the future, the climate change might also lead to new diseases, transmissive diseases that are transmitted by ticks and mosquitoes, and the area of distribution of such diseases is widening due to climate change. Next, education. Climate change and ecology are already introduced into the school curriculum and the schools of further education and further training for school teachers. They pay attention to that at schools, but I've already mentioned that during natural diseases, quite frequently the infrastructure suffers, it's destroyed, and so the access to education suffers. So during hurricanes or wind disasters, the cables get destroyed, gets severed, and people lose access to internet, which is especially important for distance learning.
Also, as a result of changes related to climate change and environment, children more seldom stay away from school. And I also mentioned the impact on mental health of children. Then reduction of risk of disasters is an important element that we cannot forget when we talk about the changes of climate and environment. And this is the area of responsibility of the State Service for Emergency Situations. And in Ukraine, we have a high level of risk and a huge impact on human health caused by flooding and forest fires. Then the mid-level of danger was assigned to the shortage of water and extreme heat. Yet in Ukraine, prevention of risk of disasters is more focused on responding and not preventing. Of course, there are some training elements when the State Service for Emergency Situation carries out information campaigns for the population, but it's more of a sporadic nature and more attention should be paid to this component. Environmental problems are part of the security of schools, but prevention of disasters should not be focused on children only. And the infrastructure is also not designed to prevent natural disasters. Even in those regions where the risk is high for floods or droughts, these elements are not taken into consideration when buildings are constructed or the entire infrastructure is designed. And probably you had a chance to come across the initiative of children-friendly cities and communities. This is one of Unicef initiatives, but since the majority of youth now lives in cities that are also subject to climate change impact, it is important that such cities and communities should be open for implementation of all opportunities and should be inclusive and adaptable to climate change responses. There are several initiatives such as green cities that Kyiv participates in. When a city or urban infrastructure is made more environmentally friendly, and we need more such initiatives because they are quite sporadic at the moment. Only some cities and towns are involved, but it is very important that these initiatives should cover the entire country. And of course, the most important aspect that brought us all together here today, that's participation of youth and children. What can you do to prevent climate change and environmental pollution? As in UNICEF, we support youth participation very actively, and we try to provide some mechanisms and some support to you to fulfill your potential. We see children and youth participation as an important element at all stages. Involving young people in the research, monitoring, surveys, of course, policy drafting and strategy development, in lobbying and representation of their interests, in evaluation of services that are provided to you. Youth and children participation is equally important at national and at a local level. In the children-friendly cities and towns should have a lot of mechanisms for involving young people in all processes, in giving them a possibility to share their ideas and to implement them. And of course, it's also very important to start with yourself, to get actively involved into all the process at the national and local levels, and to think how you as a human being, as a citizen, can change some of your habits and make your lives more sustainable and environmentally friendly. This report also contains several recommendations for all stakeholders, and these recommendations are presented in a very detailed manner in the report. You can read them on the website of UNICEF. It's already available starting today. and the basic recommendations, I'm going to present them to you, some of them, but of course their number is much bigger. So the basic recommendation is to establish the coordination mechanisms for taking into consideration the needs of youth and children. And youth and children should be seen as a target group in implementation of strategies and policies. Then a system for prevention of risk and disasters should be developed and make it more children-oriented and focused more on prevention and not on response. Then it is important to introduce an environmental element into the educational system and facilitate development of a system of indicators, because I mentioned today that in some activity areas we have very little data, and it's very important to work with data such as replacement, internal displacement related to climate changes, assessment of climate impact on human health. I mean that we do not have accurate data as there is no monitoring system that would enable us to find the cause and consequences. And then it's also very important to increase resilience on families and communities to climate change. And here I would like to end my presentation and start a discussion, which is the most important part. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Victoria, for such detailed presentation. And we already have an online question whether access will be provided to this report for young people. Yes, of course, we will share this presentation and a link to the report itself. So please follow UNICEF online and you will find all the necessary information. And I would like to mention my experience a little bit. When I was looking at this presentation, I remember that in 2015 I was one of the activists that attended a Paris event, and for me a very sensitive aspect was when I met in Waves. She was part of the delegation as well. I met indigenous people and people from island countries. They came to this COP event to protect their right to live where they live, and we were discussing such phenomenon as climate refugees, and for me that was something very distant. And now when I looked at this presentation, I realized that we live in a reality when we have this migration caused by climate changes inside our country. I don't know, are you concerned with this report? Do you worry? Yes, my worry grows as well, but I hope that this is healthy concern that will inspire us to make constructive steps forward. So let's talk constructive now. Olena, can you calm us down a little bit? I would be very grateful if you tell us more about the plans of the Ministry of Environment and maybe share some tools that young people can use to be heard. Thank you. Welcome everyone. Good morning. It's a pleasure for me to be a participant of this event and see such a big number of people interested in issues related to environment and climate, because the things we are doing today, all our actions, will have huge impact in 10, 15 years ahead, and influencing the lives of the upcoming generations. That is why we have to be active now in order to have as few consequences as possible in the future. Fighting against climate change is a relevant issue in many countries, and it's more a political issue now, because all countries realize that it is important, both in view of the negative consequences that were mentioned in the presentation, such as heat waves, floods. They are faced by all countries worldwide already. That's why there is a major understanding that we have to act. We have to do something in order to prevent and avert these climate changes. Ukraine And for the Ministry of Environmental Protection is pleased to see that climate change issues are now high on the agenda, and there are working groups created even at the level of the Prime Minister, so that it's a top governmental level now. And even during the climate conference, the head of the delegation was a Vice Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration, which means that this issue is extremely relevant. This green transformation in Ukraine is ongoing, and the sooner it's in place, the better it is for our country. And in March this year, Ukraine approved the economic strategy for the period ending 2030, in which one of the issues is climate change, and it is envisaged by 2026 Ukraine is supposed to reach the level of climate neutrality, and it's the first time that it's enshrined in such high-level document and identified as a strategic goal for our country. Also, to ensure implementation of the Paris Agreement, Ukraine approved the nationally determined contribution, which is a contribution for a reduction of greenhouse gas emission that Ukraine has to implement to reduce the global level of these emissions. And that nationally determined contribution identifies a very ambitious goal concerning emission reduction, and by the end of 2030, these goals will be revised every 5 years, and they have to reflect the ambitions of the country. And in order to ensure implementation of the document on the reduction of greenhouse gas emission, the ministry is working on developing an action plan that will include and cover the key sectors such as energy, industry, transport, agriculture, forestry, waste management sector. And in each of these priority sectors, we're going to develop a list of very specific action that will be aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And it should be mentioned that each activity that we implement will influence the level of greenhouse gas emissions in each sector, and that's why specific steps have to be developed in each sector aimed at reducing the volume of these emissions. And here we see a huge need to work together with young people, because education and awareness raising work, as well as providing access to information at the regional level for young people and for the entire population, is extremely important. And I am sure that this action plan will include such issues as provision access to information and possibilities for cooperation with the youth with regard to their projects, further action that will contribute to implementation of and achievement of our identified goals. And I would also like to mention that the strategy of adaptation strategy has been approved. It happened approximately a month ago, and this adaptation strategy also contains a plan according to which for all economic sectors of economy and various groups of population, a survey should be carried out to identify vulnerability of each of these groups and sectors to climate change, and priorities should be identified for each region, because for police there are some specific outcomes that are different for the steppe region. So for each region and groups, the negative outcomes should be surveyed and prioritize, and these priorities will be used to develop the adaptation plans, because we see that the climate change is ongoing, and unfortunately this process will continue, so we'll have to adapt to the changes that might happen in order to mitigate the consequences for us during construction, during infrastructure design and development. We should envisage possible consequences of heat waves and floods, and when we build roads and various buildings and structures, these aspects have to be taken into consideration. That is why the adaptation is also high on the agenda, and it needs to be done because prevention and adaptation will reduce the consequences and risks, mitigate the risks for us. So we will be warned, we will be alert and ready for possible negative impacts. And I would also like to mention that we are now working on developing a draft law on a low carbon development that will consolidate the bring together the maximum information and available documents into one document that will integrate all available approaches and documents. And it was finishing my presentation, I was very pleased to talk to the Deputy Minister of Youth and Sports, and we discussed some possible options and scenarios for our cooperation, because they work with the youth, we work with the climate, and that's why it's very important for us to find these common spots or starting points for us, our cooperation, for our joint effort, and for maximum involvement of young people in political decision making. That is why I hope that we will continue our cooperation and expand it, and all our documents that we are working on, all the draft instruments will be presented for public discussions, for collecting additional information. Maybe we omitted something or something can be done better. So I encourage you to follow our page on Facebook and on our website, because we post all necessary information, and we will be looking forward for well-justified proposals on improvement of the documents we are currently working on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Olena. We've already started discussing one of the important instruments that young people can influence political decisions by means of their proposals. So you can go to the website and submit your proposals. Yes, of course. The business community is very proactive for all of these legislative initiatives, because they understand the potential impact. And hopefully these suggestions will get discussed and solution will be found. Well, starting from today, fingers crossed. Ms. Natalia, would you please share how the National Council of Youth can help the young people more boldly advocate for their rights to decrease the negative influence on the quality of living? And what instruments do we have on the global, national and local level so that the voice of Ukrainian young people is heard? Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me well. Thank you for this wonderful question, and I'm mostly an expert on youth engagement, then on climate change, and before using the words like youth engagement, that's too abstract. Have you heard a concept called the Haggard Staircase? This is a number of levels, a number of criteria that we use to measure whether the young people participate. There are 8 stairs, and the first 3 are not participation at all. That's only symbolical. Real contribution happens when the young people can actually impact processes and to do it cross-sectorally. When we talk about contribution of the young people, it applies not only to the sphere of the responsibility of the Ministry of Youth, Family and Sport, that applies to creation of ourselves as the young people of Ukraine. And when we look at the official program documents, of course, it empowers us a lot. The key documents that also apply to UNICEF Global and in Ukraine is the UN Convention on Children's Rights, the General Declaration on Human Rights, and if we're talking ministerial level, occasionally, with certain periods of time, there are conventions of ministers who are responsible for young people, youth policy in their respective countries, and these are exactly the platforms that are good for discussing youth participation issues. When we discuss climate change, the global conference on climate change has just ended, and a good way to introduce the young people there are the youth delegates. That's one of the quite popular instruments that is accessible in many countries. It's usable. We have youth delegates to the UN in Ukraine. If we're talking about the climate conference, the youth delegates went to this conference actually. What is the National Youth Council of Ukraine doing? We unite the NGOs and we are a platform to exchange information, to do networking, and to discuss the topics that are of interest to the young people. In local and national context, in my personal opinion, the level of discussion is still not sufficient. It still doesn't live up to the level at the climate change conferences globally, because based on my own experience, what we've seen in our country today, from the practice of various ministries, we have numerous initiatives to empower the youth organizations so that they can administer funds, so that they can engage additional resource and cover more young people. But at the same time, we keep seeing young people as an object instead of a subject. If we're talking about the number of active organizations that are discussing these global documents, there are few of them. The climate change issue is discussed in our Ukrainian context, but it's the level of like how shall we pick the litter off our streets? Like it's of course that's the local or cleaning a river from pollution from trash and litter. Does it change the entire attitude to the system that we live in? Does it change approaches? No, this is a very micromanaging thing. And back to this conference and the instruments of youth participation, we see that in many countries that we usually attribute to the global north, Ukraine is most likely classified as the global south. At least it's nice to hear the word south. I don't know, after the Global Climate Change Conference, we have contemplated a number of things, and what the NGOs, what the National Youth Councils are talking about in various countries, you see that one of the problems is that Ukraine is not setting the goals that would be ambitious enough. What is the level of youth engagement for discussion? Are these platforms good enough to give their feedback? Uploading the documents to the ministry's websites is good, but are they understandable for the young people? So the official bureaucracy language is not the language of the young. So if we're talking about the conference, for some reason, other countries sent their delegates to protect the fact of their participation as such. It should be cross-sectoral. It should be set at various documents. And the platforms for the young people are not only the side venues of a large adult ministries convention. We need to have meaningful youth participation at both the document and practical level. One of the solutions is from the European Youth Forum that includes the national youth councils, the international youth NGOs, their solution is to enhance youth participation from the global south, including Ukraine. There are lots of instruments that are available to the young, but all of them become ineffective if we are attributing the wrong approach and the wrong the wrong senses to it. My colleagues have already mentioned that a community that is friendly to the young is one of the instruments, especially during decentralization. If we're talking about the National Youth Council as part of this initiative, we were the structure that became the co-founder and the signatory of the joint memorandum with various ministries and have advocacied including the youth component into the global initiative, because this Unicef has this age limit, 14 to 25, and in Ukrainian legislation, young people are people up to 30 years old. Formats include consultations, youth dialogues. In the European Union, there is a separate instrument of youth dialogue that hopefully will be available for Ukrainian young people as well quite soon, because we're discussing opening a separate program, launching it. And ecology and environment are the uniting issues for the Eastern Partnership and for the EU countries. They are relevant for all of us. There are lots of limitations, but it's up to us to implement our approaches to expand these limits. We need to create platforms for talking to the young people in a safe and understandable manner, and to collect proposals, suggestions that the young people can express and then translate it in the language of documents. Young people have their opinions, according to your report and many other studies, but it's up to the ministries and NGOs to transmit these ideas to the global level. The Ministry of Youth and Sport, our colleague, the Deputy Minister, Ms. Marina, used to tell us about the Youth Council. It must become a platform for co-management. For representatives of the ministry, of the local municipalities, of the NGOs, of the students' self-government. But the question is, what is the range of issues that we will impact? It's up to us not only to submit proposals, but also to influence the budget distribution. Will there be enough funding for youth issues? Is this the competence of one ministry only, or of numerous ministries? From my own experience, I can say we, as the National Youth Council, we tried to reach out to various ministries, including the Ministry of Social Policy. It is supposed to take care of the vulnerable groups of children. Who are the vulnerable groups in Ukraine? First of all, it's the children, the women who are who suffer from domestic abuse, domestic violence, and it's the competence of this exact ministry. But back in 2020, in the summer, the response from the ministry was, "Why are you addressing us with this issue?" There's the Ministry of Youth and Sport. What do you mean, why we're addressing you? Because we need to understand how to solve this problem and how to use a youth resource to do it. I can keep talking about the national and international levels. I think we should switch on to other questions I might add later. Thank you, Natalia, for mentioning this extremely important issue, that sometimes after suggestions and proposals, the process stumbles. That's a problem. So, Ecology, we'd like to hear about your experience. What do you do to make the community and the young be heard? Thank you. One of the priorities of Ecology is developing an ecologically aware community in Ukraine. We train young activists and give them the instruments of exposing pressure on the stakeholders or working in certain communities. We teach them creative ecological initiatives. We engage them to make a direct political impact, and also youth-to-youth projects. And I can agree with my colleagues that quite often, on the highest level, there is a tendency to treat the voice of the young as something decorative, symbolical, or saying nice things like, thanks for inspiring us, thanks for being so proactive, we'll keep working on this. But the climate crisis is here. It's happening, and the generation that is carries the least fault for that is suffering the most. So we shouldn't shift the responsibility to the young in the future. Let's stop hoping that they will be able by themselves to solve these problems quickly in the foreseeable future. That's wrong, that's illogical. We still have the chance to solve this global problem here and now and at the highest levels.
Ecology develops different initiatives within the framework of which young people can join various ways of influencing. Probably in our discussion we will be able to talk in more detail, and you will be able to find something where you can fulfill yourself more efficiently. Now we have this discussion already, so can you tell us a little bit more about efficient instruments and tools that Ecology uses, which tools young people can apply in order not to be so decorative and to be perceived and heard? Young people should find kind of weapons. Yesterday on the Europort page, results of a survey were presented, and one of the questions of that survey was how young people can make their actions more efficient, and one of the tools offered was education. Very often you feel that something is basically wrong, something is not going in the right direction, and you write a post in the Instagram on climate change, and then some skeptic comes up and says that during the Soviet times I read in some newspaper that it's not so. And even when you know that you are right, but you lack knowledge to prove it, that means that education is very important, education about climate and environment. And one of the solutions that we offer is the development of an online course on Edera, where we train senior grade school children and young people about the energy and its connection, energy industry and its connection to climate change. And even if you're not an engineer or IT specialist, you can join the process of overcoming energy and climate crisis. And it's so cool that not only school children and teachers also take part and attend this course because they want to know more in order to teach school children about critical knowledge and all aspects of climate change. Then if we're talking about educational activities, we should mention involvement of volunteers and young activists in in-depth studies on various interdisciplinary issues. And one of the products here is a podcast for young people, by young people who teach each other how to talk to your mother about climate change, or why potato and coffee can disappear because of the climate change, how activists can get involved and what they can do in order to make our policies more environmental friendly. That's about educational component. As to the direct impact, first of all, we should pay attention to the ability of young people to find necessary documents, to find answers for the government they might have. This spring in the metro we had posters with a QR code. These posters were developed by young designers, and this QR code referred you to the guidelines as to how you can submit a request to the governmental authorities, which answers you can receive to your questions, what are the timelines for provision of answers, and even a template of requests for people, for activists interested in showing their concern for achieving climate justice. So it was for them to teach them how to use this tool properly. And then there was such direct impact as climate march, climate campaigns in Kiev. We had a climate march. I see some people are smiling because they attended that march. It's not only about meeting like-minded people with whom you can overcome your climate worries, but that scale by itself, because these campaigns were organized not only in Kyiv but in other localities and settlements. School children joined events and marches in order to demonstrate a public interest in changing climate policy and it becoming integrated in all spheres of our lives. The most important thing is to ensure a proper response from the government, and we would be interested to see the level of its response, so the results of our marches, and we will see it after the state budget is adopted for the upcoming year, so that will demonstrate the efficiency of our campaigns. A lot of attention was paid to the energy sector that accounts for a high share of greenhouse emissions in Ukraine and worldwide. And before the renewable energy is introduced, we have to take care about energy efficiency of our actions. And young people articulated the need to allocate 1% of the state budget for energy efficiency initiatives, and this initiative has been improved and exists at the national level, and we hope that our houses will become more energy efficient and more climate friendly. Thank you, Anna. Olena, you are unlucky today because we have our young people, youth organizations, and you are the only representative of the governmental authority here, so you'll have to defend yourself. Do you have understanding, at least in your ministry? Maybe there are some platforms, but I'm not aware of them. Can you share that information with us? And can you tell us whether you have a real dialogue between the young people, civil society, and the ministry? Not through the website, but we are interested in platform for networking, for real communication, and for listening to young people. In fact, at present, this format of a dialogue, I don't think we have it. I think the biggest dialogue takes place during these marches, climate rallies, at which representatives of civil society organizations, representatives of the youth can speak, and we can join them in order to talk to them, to listen to them, and to make some decisions. But during the conference, the COP, and now we discussed the need to introduce something with the Ministry of Youth, with UNICEF, maybe not the format of a working group, but to launch kind of a platform for discussions, for education, for teaching young people how to read documents, how to react, how to respond, where to submit their requests to receive information. At university, I remember that we were taught how to formulate a document, what the layout should be, and where it has to be submitted in order to receive an answer and the most adequate response to the issue of concern. Because if you ask for a very abstract thing, you receive a very abstract response. And I think that this dialogue should be develop exactly within the framework and in the format of education and awareness raising for young people about what is going on and how they can take part in it. So I hope that within the framework of our cooperation, we will develop this model for furthering this dialogue. Thank you very much, Anna. Now you can see that new initiatives arise out of synergies between different sectors, among different sectors, and I hope it will lead up to something very powerful and efficient. And Natalia, I have a question for you. I know that youth councils were established in various communities. Are they a really efficient tool in Ukraine in the existing context? And can young people advocate for decisions through these youth councils in order to have impact on their lives? Thank you very much for this question. Youth councils are advisory and consultative entities that are established in certain bodies and agencies, and very often the format of their work depends on where they are created and who members of these youth councils are, because they can be created in local communities, in cities and towns, or they can be established under certain ministries. As far as I know, in 2019, a youth council was created in the Ministry of Information Policy. According to that logic, the members were supposed to be representatives of youth, student self-government and local self-government, but we do not have a lot of student self-government bodies that are registered that can function independently. By independent functioning, I mean that they have funding for their activities and the possibility to present their opinion and to advocate for it. Coming back to the local level, I can say that very often youth councils are used as event agencies, especially in smaller communities, because small communities, they're still at the process of their development, and talking about some meaningful impact on policies is impossible because sometimes these policies are absent, and we have an issue here that in rural areas, in smaller towns, the level of discussion is much lower compared to the level of bigger cities, the capital city or the international level, for instance. Yes, this tool can be used efficiently if you read the respective documents, if you look at what is approved by the respective entity in which the youth council is created, and if you look at the budgeting processes. So as my colleague says, that the results can be seen in the finally approved budgets, and I think the budgets are the best final indicator showing the efficiency of work of some body, some entity. Coming back to the question about youth councils, many of them are now begin to be involved into the budgeting processes, first of all through the local initiatives, and now we have another initiative called Youth-Friendly Community. And when we talk about youth participation, the first question is, do we have a youth council or should we create one? And then the climate change, is it a question for the youth? Are young people interested in that? And in how do they raise these issues? The level of discussion very often is focused on cleaning some localities, or it's about garbage sorting at the university or at school, and it's not enough, of course. I have an open question for everyone. Those of you who have solutions, please tell us what you think about how the level of discussion can be made more constructive, and what you would like the government to do. Maybe you have some real cases or suggestions about how we can bring this dialogue and cooperation to a more constructive level. I think there is a need to equip young people because at various level, at a local level or a community level, people may lack competence concerning certain aspects. So they lack knowledge. So this environmental education should be strengthened. People should be taught how they can influence local level decisions, political decisions. So young people have to be educated, and then we can exercise a bigger pressure so that people cannot avoid it.
And there was really a question about the data. The young people, even if they want to study something, there is a lack of interdisciplinary data. And if you want to get the access to climate-related data, you have to go, like, physically to the archive and do it all by hand, write it down. So what we need to give the youth is give them access to interdisciplinary data to give them a chance for a critical analysis of the situation. Are there any questions to our panelists from the audience? Right, there are. Okay. Good afternoon. My question is how the climate change impact the psychological health of children exactly and on their lifestyle. Maybe who can talk? Maybe the Unicef, because you've made this, you did this study. Yes, I'll start. Like our research showed that there is a huge lack of data aggregated. Of course, climate change impacts the psychological health of parents and children, which might lead to increase in number of domestic violence. But this lack of data for now doesn't allow us to create a solid reason and consequence correlation. So one of our recommendations was to create additional indicators so that we can be confident that we have enough information, enough data, analyze them, process them, and present them. You know, a week ago, I've installed an air quality measurement device on the roof of my house, and every time I check that device, my anxiety skyrockets. You know, so of course there is a correlation. Any other questions?
Доброго дня.
Yes, good afternoon. My question is about education. Of course, it's a wonderful idea that we need our weapon, figuratively, like a weapon to protect our opinion. And the question is how we, the young people, can influence the educational system so that on the national level we get the education of an acceptable quality. Well, apart from the students' activist groups that aim to assist other students, how can we change our educational system? Thank you. What's your name? Artem. Thanks for the wonderful question. Ms. Marina, maybe you have the solution? Well, there can be one and only answer to that question, but within the most recent 5 to 6 years, the schools are developing the curriculum about ecology, climate change, and environment. In several years after I graduated from my school, my former teachers told me happily that they've got this course introduced, and they are puzzled what to tell the children during those classes. I think we need to enhance the number of such disciplines, and they should be introduced not only when children are in 10th or 11th grade at high school, but from the kindergarten and junior high to teach children to sort the waste, to recycle, or to switch off the lights when you step out of the room, or to stop the water from tap when you're brushing your teeth. So the attention should be given to enhancing the climate education from the very first years at school. You've mentioned the student activist groups, and I have a feedback from my own experience. We do have our so-called student self-government, but what is their role? I am originally from Ivano-Frankivsk, and I went to one of the best schools in the city. We even had a local self-government, we had student-led elections, but nobody actually understood what we are supposed to do next after the president of the school is elected. And this is very sad, because when we look at the experience of other countries, these school activists are registered as NGOs, and they are setting their own agenda in the sphere of granting educational services, and they are launching dialogues from themselves as students, and they are ready to set this bar, to set this level. And they are ready to give this information inquiry, and the adults, the school, the local authorities are forced. They must react to these inquiries. Otherwise, they would lose their positions. I went to Ivan Franko University, and I studied Oriental Studies. I studied Oriental languages and cultures. And the list of our niche disciplines was very short, because there was very few specialists, and it was up to decide whether the native speaker would come to teach us, whether there will be adequate, sufficient funding. So the children also must have a say in what the curriculum and the studying modules look like, at least partly. So, as that all gains cross-sectorial importance, that would mean that students that are majoring at international relations, economy, or chemistry, they must have this free slot in their curriculum that is free for choice. And one of such options to be chosen from would include the climate change. In our presentation, in the beginning, we've mentioned urban studies, city studies, which is connected directly to the climate crisis, to the environment that we live in. It all depends on ourselves and on our ability to do advocacy for our own rights, and to undertake the responsibility for our own future and the future of our next generations. And another brief question. Thank you. I have a question that's very related to the previous one, but from a different angle. I'll give you an illustration of my own case. My team and I won a huge chunk of funding for education in villages, and we invited very cool speakers, and we brought them to villages to run lectures. But it all sounded great and fine, but the interest from people who had no education in that sphere before, it was almost non-existent. Very often, these educational events have the same audience, like the people who don't need to be preached to. They are already interested in that issue. How do we bring the non-interested audience into this sphere? Well, I'll partly give you an answer that the problem, the most pressing one, is that it's very efficient to work with those who are already believers, who believe in your idea and they're ready to do something, because doing something from a rational point of view to impact people, to change their thinking, to use emotions, to this educational process, that might be challenging. I know business communities that go to villages and let people wear VR glasses and take a look at the green energy stations. That's more edutainment that can alleviate the tension in the society, to make it more understandable, to make these eco elements less scary. If we're talking about educational initiatives, it's really cool that these interested people come to your events. You can unite them into a certain initiative and do something specific. Thank you, Anya.
And I have a small remark, because from my experience, we should try to find the local problem of people with whom you work at a local level, because at the local level, education differs from Kiev and from the bigger cities, and it's not the level we would like to expect and have. And when you go to the local level, you should ask people in the first place what they need and how you can help them, and then you provide them with the tool without making their work for them, because otherwise it will never be successful, and everything will be reduced to a project within which you visit as many places as possible and do everything according to the expected indicators of the project, but the sustainability will never be achieved in this way. This is a small revelation we had from discussions at a local level, because when I was told that why should young people support SDGs at a local level, because they are more interested in finding jobs. But it's still the SDG, but at a different level of discussion. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you for this discussion, for sharing your experience and knowledge, and I hope that your anxiety level went down a little bit. And I would like to sum it up. In order to move not to plus 2 degrees Celsius, but to plus 1.5 degrees, we have to be equipped with knowledge. We have to be aware ourselves, because we live in the 21st century and information is accessible. Then you have to share this knowledge with people around you. Yes, you have a tool how to talk to your mother and persuade her that climate change is about her as well. How to talk to people in their language, as Natalia mentioned, that the level of the discussion should be not at your level, but at the level of the audience you're talking to. Then you have to come together. If you have two more people from the same community who are worried and have this anxiety, create a team, because small groups can change the world, and you can see it in global history. And don't forget to exercise pressure on decision making. For that, you have to be aware who makes the respective decisions. Thank you very much again for this discussion, and I wish that we find more solutions to what we can do. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, friends, for your questions. And really, it is important that everyone can join the processes related to fighting against climate change. It is important, as Natalia said, that you as young people find opportunities to join these changes, and let us move on step by step. And our next panel discussion will be about what happened during the largest conference in the world, the largest climate conference, COP26, that our speakers mentioned. And online we'll have a break. We will come back at noon.